Okay, so welcome to Ship Mechanics. In this class we're going to discuss all the different ways and attributes that affect your ship, at least the most common ones, and we'll talk about things you can do to influence each of them or modify their effect on your ship, as well as what people can do to you to modify those very same attributes. We'll also be talking about all of this at a pretty high level, so I won't be drilling down too much into individual things because on some of these topics they could be classes in and of themselves, but we'll try to give you a good survey-style overview of all the things you might care about. So, first up, I hope that everyone is following along on the screen leap link that's been posted by me and by Flip a few times. So if you're not viewing that, please make sure you are viewing it now. And if you are viewing it, you'll notice that I've got a slasher fit open right now. This is a frigate that is the T1 Attack Frigate for the Minmatar race. Each of the four races has a Attack Frigate and the Attack Frigate, the frigate variant that's a little bit faster and a little bit less tankier. And I'll just be using that as a demonstration example today. And as you can see in the tabs, there's going to be several examples that we'll go through. So first up, let's cover the fitting attribute. So fitting means anything that limits the capabilities of your ship on some particular axis. So, no, I don't want to turn on filter keys. Give me 1 second to disable that. Okay, sorry about that. So, fittings, any of the fitting attributes, which are your CPU, your power grid, and your 2 drone fitting, and also the number of slots you have. And your ship class is also part of your fitting attributes. So let's go through each of those one at a time. So you can see here, this is our CPU for this particular fit. If I started a new slasher, let's just start from scratch and see where that gets us. So you can see that the slasher has 4 high slots, 4 medium slots, 2 low slots, and 3 rig slots. It also has 168 CPU, 43 megawatts of power grid, and it doesn't get any drone bay, so it has no ability to carry drones, and it has no ability to launch drones. You notice that, by the way, already you can see that your CPU and power grid are affected by your skills. A character with no skills gets a much lower CPU and power grid, whereas a character with all 5s gets a much higher CPU and power grid. And you can see that my particular character also gets the max CPU and power grid. 2 skills that affect your CPU and power grid that you're going to want to train pretty soon to 5 are electronics. Electronics skill book, please link that. Electronics skill book influences your maximum CPU, and the energy systems operation skill influences your. So training those 2 skills to 5 will increase. I'm sorry, it's energy management, not energy systems operation. Energy management is the one I was thinking of. So energy systems operation reduces your cap recharge time. Energy management increases your capacitor, and engineering is the one that increases your power grid output. Thanks for that. What? Huh, that's weird. Okay. Sounds like a couple of people are having issues with my mumble. Okay, I'll try to make sure that I speak more slowly. Alrighty, so let's go back. So CPU and power grid are the 2 main limiting factors, along with the slots in your ship, that will prevent you from fitting as much as possible. Generally, CPU limits your ability to fit modules that that are sort of size independent, that don't have anything to do with your ship's size. So, for example, an adaptive invulnerability field 2, that module is applicable to every kind of ship, and it takes up the same CPU. In comparison, a large shield extender is a different module than a small shield extender. You would only want to put a large shield extender on a medium or a large size ship, and you probably never want to fit a small shield extender to anything, but a medium shield extender, let's say, takes up a different amount of power grid, and the power grid tends to scale with the size of the ship you're talking about. So bigger ships do get more power grid and more CPU, but they generally their power grid goes up much more quickly than their CPU does. So in a way, CPU limits the modules that you have that aren't really relevant, that aren't really based on size, and CPU tends to scale, you'll see in Eve, with the number of slots that you have. So more slots equals more CPU, whereas bigger ships equals more power grid. Drones, of course, are only applicable to some kinds of ships. Your drone bay tells you how many and how much in terms of size drones you can fit. So the Slasher has no drone bay, so we won't discuss it further for this bit. But if you're flying a Caldari ship or a Galente ship, you'll probably be more likely to see drone bays, and some of Mars ships too. The megabits are the drone megabit per second. That's your drone bandwidth. That tells you how many drones you can launch simultaneously based on how much space they take up in terms of that bandwidth. So each drone takes up not only a certain amount of space in your cargo bay, but it also takes up a certain amount of bandwidth to communicate with it when it's out in space. That's further limited by your drone skill. So your drone skill will limit how many drones you can have out on the field at a time. You can see if you have no skills, you won't be able to field any drones. If you have all 5 skills, you'll be able to field 5 drones. And then finally, your ship class. In this case, we're looking at a Slasher, and the class of ship is frigate size or small size. Your ship class determines whether or not certain kinds of modules can be fitted at all. Now, normally that would be limited anyway by your power grid and CPU, but in some cases it's actually specific to the class of ship. So, for example, you can never ever fit a medium rig to a small ship, because the prerequisite for a rig is that it be on the size of ship that the rig is supposed to be for. So, for example, again, you can't fit the wrong size rig to a different kind of ship. So those four things, your drones, CPU, power grid, and ship size, all affect what you can fit to your ship. So next up, we have some of the structural items on your ship. So the structural pieces are all of the elements of your ship that are based on the structure and the kind of ship you have. So that includes your ship size, your ship mass, the inertia, and the velocity of your ship. So it's not covered here in Python. So let's go ahead and open the slash. I'm sorry, it sounds like some more mobile issues. Could someone please link the Slasher fit in the class.euni chat? Yes, Alex, I'll discuss calibration later. Who's my linker? Is it Gillian Gray? Okay, never mind. I think I've got it from before. All right, there's the Slasher. Okay, so you can see the Slasher. If you go to the Attributes tab there, scroll on down to the bottom, and take a look at, I'm sorry, actually it's at the top, the Structure section. So at the very top you'll see the Structure section, and these first 5 attributes are the structural elements of your ship. So the Structure hit points tells you how many hit points the hull of your ship gets. So once your armor and shields are both depleted, then your ship will start going into structure, and once all of your structure is depleted, your ship explodes. The capacity tells you how big your cargo bay is, so that's the largest amount of items you can fit inside your cargo bay. You can improve this by adding cargo hold optimizers, and that's the rig, and then cargo hold extenders, that's the module. Sorry, cargo hold expanders, excuse me. So if you expanded cargo hold 1 and 2 will increase your cargo bay, and the cargo hold optimizer rigs will also improve your cargo bay. Unlike some of the other modules we'll see later, cargo hold optimizers don't have any stacking penalty, which means that you get lots and lots of benefits from stacking all of them together. In fact, it's possible to turn some frigate-sized ships into mini industrial class ships by loading up all of their rig slots and all of their all of their low slots with cargo bay expanders. Okay, and then this next stat, your mass, isn't particularly relevant except in a few cases. For example, if you're going through a wormhole, there's a maximum amount that each wormhole can sustain before it collapses. So every time you jump a ship through a wormhole, that deducts that ship's mass from the wormhole's mass limit. And once the wormhole's mass limit reaches 0, you have collapsed the wormhole. Next up, you have this volume. This tells you how much your ship will take up if you try to ship it around. So if you wanted to put your ship into a bigger ship's cargo bay, this tells you that this ship unpackaged would take up 17,400 cubic meters, or it would take up 2,500 cubic meters if it was packaged. So packaging ship means you destroy all of the rigs, and you can't have any modules that are attached to it. It's basically like you just bought the ship from the market. And then finally, this inertia modifier is very interesting. Again, this by itself isn't particularly useful, but when we multiply the mass times the inertia modifier, that gives us a number that we can use to compare against other ships. So for example, if someone were to link, say, Gillian, if you could link the Dominic's battleship. So if everyone takes a look at the Dominic's, you'll see that the mass there is 100 million kilograms, and then it has an inertia modifier of 0.12. So if we multiply 0.12 times that 100 million kilogram mass, that's about a mass inertia factor of about 12 million. If you compare that to the slasher, so if you multiply the 1 million kilogram mass by the roughly 3 inertia modifier, that's a total mass factor of about 3 million. So from that, we would infer that the slasher is about 4 times as agile as the Dominic's. That means it takes 4 times less time to align to things, 4 times, it can turn 4 times as fast, it can hold a tighter orbit, etc., etc. So that's how we could compare the agility of two ships. If we multiply its mass times its inertia modifier, let's see maybe an even more agile example. Let's take a look at, say, the Stiletto. That's one of the Minmatar interceptors. So if you take a look at the Stiletto, it's got a mass of 1.1 kilogram, or 1.1 million times an inertia modifier of 3.1. So you might say, oh well, that seems silly. Now I actually have a slightly larger mass, but because of skills that you would have to fly this ship to begin with, it actually winds up being less than the slasher. And in addition, the real benefit of interceptors, which we'll talk about later, is that they have a very low signature radius penalty from using micro warp drive. So they're not only are they really fast, they're also very, very difficult to hit because they show up as very tiny to opposing weapon systems. So that covers the structural elements of your ship. Those are all the attributes that are kind of specific to your ship's hull. And we'll see, if you look at PIFA on the bottom, you'll see a couple of these attributes taken into account here. So you can see that the speed of the ship, which is part of the navigational section inside the Eve window, is listed there. And the align time, which is how long it takes for the ship to, it's the minimum amount of time it takes the ship to turn to a new direction. So if you rotate at all, it would take you at least 2.8 seconds to stabilize and be pointed in a new direction. So, for example, if you were trying to warp away from something, for example, maybe trying to escape a gate camp, it would take you at least 2.8 seconds to align to a new destination and then warp off in that direction. Then you've got your signature radius, which we'll talk about later. Your warp speed, which is how quickly your ship can move through space when it's warping. So just like ships have a regular sub-warp speed, they also have a maximum warp speed too. Adakika asks, due to 1 second server ticks, should one round up to the nearest second? That's a good question. I would not say so, not necessarily just because, for example, if you have if you have something that takes 2 seconds, it's not always going to take at least 3. It really depends on which side of the tick you land on. Foxfire Aderin asks, doesn't it matter which way you are facing? That is a minimum warp align time. So if you're facing 180 degrees from whatever you're trying to align to, it will take you much longer than 2.8 seconds. Horatius Mooring asked, where can you find the information in Eve like warp speed? That's part of the ship attributes. So, for example, if you look at the slasher under the propulsion section, which is all the way at the bottom of the attributes tab, you'll see the max velocity. That's your sub-warp velocity, and then your ship warp speed. That's your maximum warp speed. Oh, you don't see the align time, but you see. You asked about warp speed, so. Warp speed is there. Align time is based on a formula that's mostly affected by that mass times inertia factor we described before. Okay, next up are your electronics attributes. So the first and most important of these probably is your signature radius. Your signature radius measures how large your ship is with respect to enemies trying to target you. So it's not the actual physical size of your ship, but it's sort of like your ship's electronic footprint. And the more modules you have on your ship that sort of increase that signature radius, that make you appear bigger, the easier it is for people to lock onto you. The time it takes people to lock on, and the easier you are to hit with specific kinds of weapons. Vulpus Velox Squall asks, do other factors affect these stats like skills? Yes, definitely. For example, your navigation and spaceship command skills affect how fast and agile your ship is. Your advanced spaceship command skill will affect your agility for ships that require advanced spaceship command, and so on. Foxfire Aderin asks, so if you have a smaller signature radius, it takes someone longer to lock onto you. Yes, that's correct. We've got a Caracal, that's a cruiser, and we've got a Hurricane, that's a battle cruiser, so 3 progressively larger ships. Let's take a look at the scan resolution and signature radius of each of those ships. So we can see that the Slasher has a signature radius of 30, and it's got a scan resolution of about 1200 millimeters. The Caracal has a signature radius of, actually that's much larger than it should be because the micro-warp drive's on. The Caracal has a signature radius of 175 meters, and it's got a scan resolution of 340 meters. So let's go back to the Slasher. You see the Slasher's signature radius is comparatively tiny. It's it's about 1/6 of the Caracal signature radius. And it's got a scan resolution that's about 4 times as large, so it can lock onto things significantly quicker than the Caracal can. Now, conversely, this Caracal is going to have a hard time locking onto that Slasher because its scan resolution is much lower. If one Slasher was trying to lock onto another, the Slasher would be able to get a lock much quicker than the Caracal could. Next, you got the Hurricane, that's the battle cruiser, and you can see that its scan resolution, again, is even lower than the Caracal's is. And its signature radius is also larger than the Caracal is. So as you go up in ship class, you get bigger and bigger signature radii, and you get smaller and smaller scan resolutions. Foxfire Aderin asks, scan resolution higher is better. Yes, higher scan resolutions are better. It means you have a quicker locking time. And signature radius lower is better because it means it takes longer to lock onto you, and it also means that guns have a harder time hitting you and missiles have a harder time hitting you. It's not affected by signature radius. Doesn't having a low or high signature radius does not affect things like smart bombs or as much as guns and missiles do. Okay, next up. Okay, people are saying I cut out again. So your warp core strength is not an attribute that's visible anywhere on your attributes. So if you take a look at certain ships, though, you'll see that they have a warp core strength modifier. We'll talk about what that is in a second, but could someone please link the Venture? And then if you can also link the Warp Scrambler and the Warp Disruptor. So take a look at the Venture and then go to the description of the Venture, and you'll see that it has a roll bonus, and that roll bonus includes +2 warp core strength. Now if you compare that to the warp, let's say the Warp Scrambler module, you'll see that it has a warp scramble strength of 2. These two factors interact with each other in a way that tells you whether or not you will be prevented from warping. Every ship in EVE starts with a warp core strength of 0. And then, depending on your ship, you get modifiers to your warp core strength. So in the case of the Venture, you get a warp core strength of +2. So starting from 0, you get a +2 bonus, which is a total of 2. And then each time you get a Warp Scrambler or Warp Disruptor or anything else that applies Warp Scramble strength points to your ship, that is counted against your ship's Warp Core strength. If the Warp Scramble strength of all the scrambling that's being applied against you exceeds your Warp Core strength, then you are prevented from warping. So you'll still see the little warp scrambling icon appear above your capacitor, but you may not actually be prevented from warping unless and until the warp scramblers applied to your ship overcome your ship's warp core strength. So you don't just need to have a particular kind of ship if you want to resist being warp scrambled. You can also fit the warp core stabilizer modules. So if someone could link the warp core stabilizer modules. Those modules will also enable you to add points to your warp core strength. So you can see that for each warp core stabilizer you fit, you get it's represented here as a -1 to warp scramble strength, which you can think of as being equivalent to +1 to your warp core strength. So Fire Dragon 64 asks, so if you use a warp core scrambler against a Venture, you still need another disruptor or scrambler to actually prevent the warp, right? Correct, yes. A warp scrambler applies 2 points of warp scramble strength, and since that's equal to the amount of warp core strength but not in excess of it for the Venture, you have not actually prevented it from warping. You need 3 or more points of warp scramble strength, assuming, again, the Venture doesn't have any warp core stabilizers on it, of course. You'll notice, by the way, the warp core stabilizer gives you 2 very significant penalties. It dramatically reduces your scan resolution, which means it takes you much longer to lock things, and it also dramatically decreases your targeting range. So any ship that fits a warp core stabilizer is effectively useless in combat, and you probably would never want to fit that if you were planning on going into combat. Volpes Velox Squall asks, would multiple scramblers or disruptors from multiple ships stack, or is it just one disruptor or scrambler applied at the total against you? Yes. Multiple scramblers and disruptors do stack, and they have their stacking penalties, so they count at full strength. Foxfire Adoran asks, does that make minor gankers mad? Yes, it does. Ghost Recon asks, is that a change? I thought your warp core strength had to exceed the warp, I assume that's supposed to be warp scramble strength, in order to be able to warp. That is correct. You just inverted what I said, which is that your warp scramble strength on you has to be higher to prevent you from warping, which is exactly the same thing as saying that your warp core strength has to be has to exceed your warp scramble strength in order to be able to warp. Okay, so that's again one of those statistics that's not reflected anywhere on PIFA. It's just something it's also Okay, Ghost Recon asks, so a warp scrambler will prevent a venture from warping because the warp core strength does not exceed the warp scrambler strength. No, a warp scrambler will not prevent a venture from warping because 2 points of warp scramble strength is not a higher number than 2 points of warp core strength, which is what the venture has, is 2 points of warp core strength. Okay, let's move on. So engineering talks about the warp core strength. Let's move on to your capacitor. So your capacitor is, again, something that's determined by your ship's hull. It has a total amount, which is governed by your specific ship. And again, that's influenced by your skills. So you can see that somebody with 0 skills gets a much lower capacitor. Specifically, you get up to 25% additional capacitor by having full skills. In addition, you can significantly increase your capacitor recharge rate. So you can see that this amount means that your capacitor will recharge 5 gigajoules per second, and at a total capacity of 240, that means it'll close up much quicker. And at full skills, you'll get almost another 60% additional capacitor recharge rate. So very, very useful to have that this person's capacitor is going to recharge much, much quicker than the person with 0 skills. And there's a property we like to talk about that's not explicitly measured as part of your ship, but is sort of calculated based on the modules you have, and that's cap stability. Cap stability tells you whether or not you can run your capacitor indefinitely with all of the modules active at the same time. So let's look at some examples of that. So here's that slasher fit from before, and we can see that this slasher is cap stable. So cap stable means that my capacitor will, if I run all of these modules, all the ones that have little green check marks next to them are active modules. That means that I have to either activate them or turn them on to do something with them. Whereas, say, my coprocessor 2 on this ship doesn't require any activation. It's a passive module. So that means that this ship is cap stable because my capacitor recharge rate's higher than the capacitor consumption of all the modules when they're being activated. So if I turn some of these modules off, you'll see that my capacitor recharge rate stays the same, but my consumption drops and my cap stability increases. So if I turn the afterburner back on, you can see that my capacitor is stable, but at a lower point. And if I replace this afterburner with a micro warp drive, so you can see that now I'm no longer cap stable. Now my capacitor lasts for 40 seconds. I wouldn't actually be able to fit this because I exceed the maximum CPU and power grid. But assuming that I did fit it, this wouldn't help me. This would not help my capacitor situation. You can see that now my capacitor recharge rate is lower than my capacitor consumption. And even worse, my capacitor recharge rate has actually gone down from where it was before. Vulpes Velox Squall asks, so in the fitting screen, that's the red that states depletes in 10 seconds. Yes. If you're in your Eve fitting window, if you see red text above your capacitor, that means that your capacitor will, if it's only 10 seconds, that's, I think that tells me you need to improve your engineering and energy systems operation skills a little bit. But yes, that is what that means. Okay, and again, notice that with the micro warp drive, my capacitor is, if I have that running, I get shafted on the capacitor. So even if I don't run it, I'm still losing the overall capacitor size. If I don't run it, my capacitor will last longer, but just having it online is enough to affect my capacitor. If I turn it offline, that would prevent the capacitor penalty. So generally speaking, anything that's an active module will consume capacitor, with a few exceptions. So guns don't consume capacitor, and projectile guns don't consume capacitor, and missiles don't consume capacitor. There are a few other exceptions, but those are the two. It doesn't really matter which one, Gillian, just any beam laser. A beam laser, Gillian? Thank you, Gillian. Okay, so if you take a look at, well, this is a very large weapon. If you take a look at the attributes tab of the Mega Beam Laser that Gillian linked, you'll see that it has a activation cost, and that activation cost is what you'll see for any module that requires a capacitor when you activate it. So each time that module cycle completes, you will use up that many units of your capacitor. So in this case, we see that the cycle time is 9 seconds, since the rate of fire for this weapon is 9 seconds. If we look at something that's not a weapon, let's say the Adaptive Invulnerability Field 2. So if you take a look at this, you'll see that instead of having a rate of fire, it instead has a activation time. So you'll see here that the activation time for this module is 10 seconds. So that's just like the rate of fire. So every 10 seconds, you will use up 32 gigajoules of capacitor. Sorry, guys, it sounds like... Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I'm not sure what's happening here. I think... let me just pop into the echo channel real quick and see what's going on to see if this is a server issue or this is a me issue. Okay, we'll just run with it. I'm hearing some people say that they're not having any problems. Other people say that they are, so I'm wondering if I'm overloading the channel with all the people in here at once. Well, we'll just continue on and pretend like this. People are saying my microphone cable, that I don't think that could be the problem. If my key isn't lighting up at all, then that's not a cable issue. Then that would be either a push-to-talk issue or the server not getting my packets. So again, I'm not sure what's happening with that, but let's oh, is that what it is? People recording the class? How many people are recording? There are 3 people. That's not too many. Okay, if you're not a Takiga, though, could you not record the class? That I do know that the Mumble has server issues with that. So House Azale and Vanky Vanquish, please cut your recordings. Okay, I'm sorry about those technical issues. Okay, so let's continue on. Again, the capacitor is sort of your lifeblood. You want to make sure that wherever possible and relevant that you are cap stable. Skills will help you improve that. So will certain modules like capacitor rechargers and capacitor boosters. Okay, next let's move on to the defense. Foxfire Adoran asks, what does the 44.4% mean? That means that if I ran everything indefinitely, eventually my capacitor would settle down at 44%. So if I ran everything forever, eventually my capacitor would keep decreasing more and more slowly until it reached 44%. And that is the point where my recharge has overcome my capacitor consumption. If I wasn't cap stable, then that number is less than 0, and it means that I've run out of capacitor before I stabilize. Okay, let's move on to the defensive section. So this is a little tricky. Let's start with a blank slasher, and you can see that I have my shield section here, my armor section, and my hull section. Each of these rows represents the resistances and hit points for each of those sections. So in this case, my shield hit points are 603, my armor hit points are 556, and my structural hit points are 375. So the total of these three numbers is my raw hit points. So my raw hit points are these three numbers added up. My effective hit points, though, those are my raw hit points. So 438 plus 375 plus 375. My effective hit points are my hit points when you take into account the kind of damage I'm going to be receiving. So, for example, if I had, let's imagine that I had 99% explosive resistance and I had 1,000 shield hits. Well, that would mean that for every 100 points of explosive damage, I only take 1 point. So someone would have to do 100 times as much as my shield hit points worth of explosive damage before they hit me, before they flew through all of my shields. So that's what your effective hit points are measuring, is they take into account incoming damage versus your resistances. Now you'll note that that depends very heavily on what kind of incoming damage you have. So in this case, we're assuming that the damage is equally applied so that your opponent is firing all types of damage equally. That's not a particularly realistic situation in that there aren't really many situations where an opponent is going to be firing all four kinds of weapons, weapon damage evenly distributed against you. There are some NPC cases where that happens. So, for example, sleeper rats and wormholes will deal omni damage, but generally speaking, you're not going to find that to be the case. So I've set up a few damage profiles here that show you the difference between what happens if we assume that your opponent is firing 100% in a particular damage type. So in this case, again, we're using a slasher, no shield mods, no armored mods, no tank whatsoever, totally empty. I hope you would never undock a ship look like this, but let's see what happens to our effective hit points as we change around. So let's start explosive damage. So here we're assuming that our the damage profile is entirely explosive damage. That is, your opponent is only shooting explosive type weapons at you. Maybe they're shooting explosive missiles, for example. Those would be 100% explosive damage. And because explosive is our highest resist, and because our shield hit points are where we have that highest resist, our EHP and our shields has gone way up. Conversely, if I switch you all electromagnetic damage, now our EHP on the shields goes way down. In fact, the EHP is equal to the raw HP because there's no resistance at all. Whereas if I switch to explosive, the EHP doubles because I have 50% resistance. So I take half as much damage from explosive weapons, so the person shooting me needs to do twice as much damage to overcome my shields. So therefore, my explosive damage resistance is 50%. So as you change the damage profiles on shields from explosive towards electromagnetic, you'll see the effective hit points decrease. So kinetic has worse resistances than explosive on my shield, so it drops. And thermal has still worse resistance until finally electromagnetic has the worst resistance of all, and I'm back to my raw hit points. And you notice that shield resistances increase from left to right, whereas armor resistances increase from right to left. So whereas my weakest resist is explosive on armor, it's my strongest resist on shield. So you can see that the shifting mix of armor and shield hit points contributes to my overall effective hit points. So as my explosive and as the mix of damage changes, you'll see the effective hit points up here adjust accordingly. But you can see that the best case scenario actually is either electromagnetic or explosive. So if I have absolutely nothing on my ship, I get the best possible defense on electromagnetic because I have enough resistance to compensate for the fact that I'm getting no resistance on my shield here. Again, very unrealistic. So let's say that you start off this slasher with a medium shield extender, which is a pretty reasonable module to have as a T1 frigate tank. Okay, so instantly you can see that my shield hit points have tripled on, actually more than tripled. If I take that off, you'll see this is 438 without the medium shield extender, and it's 1750 with the shield extender. So that's about a 4x increase in my shield hit points. And now, because the bulk of my buffer tank is in shields, if I switch to explosive damage, you'll see that my EHP is way, way higher on shields now. So my overall effective hit points is much higher when I'm tanking explosive damage than electromagnetic damage. Horatius Mirroring asks, where can you change the damage dealt in EFT? It's similar to Python. If you right-click on your damage profiles, it will let you set up new ones. So again, changing the mix of resistances will affect your overall effective hit points. So let's try adding some other resistance modules here. So here I've added 2 adaptive invulnerability fields. Not a particularly great choice to have 2 of these on a slasher. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You've wasted valuable slots that you could have been using for, say, a stasis web or a warp scrambler or something like that. So that's not a particularly great choice in terms of a good fit. But just for purposes of this exercise, notice that our resistances have gone significantly up here. Adding that first, let's just add that first one. So adding that first adaptive invulnerability field gave us significantly more resist on each of these. You'll notice that if we look at the module here, you'll see that this adds 30% resistance on each of the 4 resistance types. So 30% on your thermal, 30% on EM, 30% on explosive, and 30% on kinetic. Now, the way resistances work is that it's not 30% added to your actual percentage. It's 30% of the way between where you are and 100%. So that's a little confusing. So let's take a look at that as an example. So without the adaptive invulnerability field on, I have an EM resistance of 0% and a thermal resistance of 20%. If I turn it on, I get an EM resistance of 30% and a thermal resistance of 44%. I get 30% EM resistance because I started at 0, and 30% of the way between 0 and 100 is 30. So you can see I went from 0 to 30 EM resistance. And I went from 20 to 44 thermal resistance. I didn't go from 20 to 50 thermal resistance because 30% of the way between 20 and 100 is 24%. And so 24% is added to my thermal, not 30%. So that means that as you add additional resistance modules, each subsequent resistance module doesn't give you quite the same benefit. So if I add a second adaptive invulnerability field, I don't get 30% of the way between 0 and 100% like I did before. I'm now only getting 30% of the way between 30 and 100%. And on top of that, I now have stacking penalties, because whenever you add 2 modules that do the same thing, you see this little note in the description. Whenever you have 2 modules that do the same thing and they have this penalty indicator in the description, you'll get a stacking penalty that decreases the effectiveness of each subsequent module that you apply. The stacking penalty for 2 modules is about 83%. So that means that the second adaptive invulnerability field is only about 83% as effective as the first one. So instead of giving me 30% additional resist, it's giving me about 83% of that 30%. That said, those resistances become much more useful as they get higher and higher, because if I add 9, let's just take an example. If I add 9% to my EM resistance starting from 0, then I can take about 1/10 more damage. So if I go from 0 to 9%, I can take about 110% of the damage that I used to be able to take. But if I went from 90% to 99%, then I can take 10 times as much damage as I used to be able to take. So if I have 90% EM resist and I can tank, and I have a raw hit points of, let's say, 1,000 on my shield, then that means someone has to, I'm only taking 10% of that damage, so someone would have to do 10,000 roughly points of damage before I would get all the way through my shield. But if I went to 99% resist, then they'd have to do 100 times as much damage to get all the way through my shield. So each additional percentage point of resistance is exponentially more effective than the previous point of resistance. So the more resistance you have, the better it is, and the better and better it gets with each new percentage point. So you'll notice that there are actually 3 different kinds of buffers you have. You have your hull resistance, you've got your your hull hit points, your armor hit points, and shield hit points, and they all have different resistance characteristics too. However, hull doesn't start out with any resistances at all, whereas every ship starts out with some kind of shield or armor resistance. So that means that hull tanking in general is a very, very bad idea for that reason. And generally, you want to tank based on 2 factors. Usually, you would tank based on the highest base hit points you have. So, for example, in the case of a slasher, you'll see that the highest base hit points is in the shield versus the armor or the hull. So this is a hint that you want to be tanking on shield, since you have more shield hit points to start with. Another good hint that you probably want to tank on shield is the fact that you have 4 medium slots, and medium slots are where your shield boosting and shield increasing modules go. By contrast, you only have 2 low slots, which is where your armor boosting and armor tanking modules would go. So that means that that's a pretty good hint that you probably don't want to armor tank your slasher here. So you can see that the Inquisitor has higher armor hit points than its shield hit points. So that's a good hint that you want to be armor tanking this ship. And again, notice that the low slots are more numerous than the medium slots. So that's a hint that you want to be armor tanking. There are other considerations. It's not as simple as just look at how many slots of each kind and look at the base hit points. There are more intricate considerations, like maybe if you want to be kiting, you should probably focus on shield instead of armor, that kind of thing. Khan Zim asked, isn't that good for shield tanking in reference to a power diagnostic system too? It is good at shield tanking in the sense that if you had to fit a low slot module for shield tanking, that would be a good one to fit. However, in terms of the alternatives, that is actually a terrible module for shield tanking. For example, you see that the shield hit point bonus is 5%, and which is really nothing. On a slasher, that would make about 25 hit points worth of difference. That's less than 1 round. That's less than 0.2 seconds worth of DP at you from a ship. So not a particularly effective choice if you're trying to shield tank. At least not on a frigate anyway. Okay, so one other thing to note is that unlike your armor or your hull, your shield hit points will regenerate over time. And in this case, I've got a shield booster active on this fit. But if I didn't do anything, my shield would actually get a passive recharge rate. So in this case, if I do absolutely nothing, I get 3.7 additional hit points every second at my peak recharge rate. Your peak recharge rate occurs around 1/4 of your shield hit points. So the closer you get to 25% shield, the higher this recharge rate gets until it's at 3.7 hit points. That's why you may notice if you get shot once or twice, it takes a long time for that last 5% of your shield to come back than when you're deeper into shield. Now if I active tank, so in this case I'm using a shield booster this is a special kind of shield booster called an ancillary shield booster. So regular shield boosters, you just run them and they use up your capacitor. An ancillary shield booster gives you much larger shield boosts, but it also consumes capacitor booster charges. And when you run out of capacitor booster charges, it takes out huge chunks of your capacitor. So if I unload my capacitor charges here, you'll see that it takes off a whopping 60 gigajoules of capacitor, and my capacitor will last for 2 seconds with it running without the capacitor charges. So effectively, you need the capacitor charges in this module to run it. And when it runs out, you are no longer able to shield boost. You can see that with the cap booster charges, I'm actually stable because this doesn't use up any capacitor as long as the cap boosters are in there. So in this case, you can see that my shield boosting is 77 hit points per second while I'm active tanking. So it's a pretty strong active tank for a frigate. That means that I could probably absorb about one full volley of. I can probably negate any incoming volleys at frigate level DPS. Thomas8619 Mokator asked, can you use any of the booster charges? You can, but you would never want to use anything other than the smallest possible booster you could fit in there, because otherwise you get fewer cycles because you can't fit as many boosters as you could before. So for example, if I switch this to the capacitor booster 100, I can only fit 3 charges, which means I only get 3 cycles out of this, which is not a good situation. So I want to fit the smallest possible booster I can fit. The Navy boosters are smaller. They're the faction modules, and they're more expensive, but they'll let you fit a couple of extra cycles in there. So Navy cap boosters are the best if you can afford them. If I switch to a medium shield booster, the regular kind, actually, I'll just use a small shield booster. You can see that I have different numbers here. This reinforced means as long as I have capacitor, how strong is my tank? So my tank is 24 hit points per second with a small shield booster. But eventually I'll run out of capacitor. So my actual long-term tank is 4 hit points per second. So that's what those two numbers mean. It's important to notice the difference between those two because if you're not cap stable, these numbers won't be equal. Okay, so that covers our defensive wrap-up. Let's go on to offense. Let me get back my micro warp drive and my medium shield extender here. Oh, that was an afterburner, not a micro warp drive. Whoops. What did I? I'll figure it out later. Oh, that's right. It was a medium shield booster, not a shield extender. Whoops. There we go. Okay. Now I can fit that again. So let's see how that plays. So in this case, I obviously have chosen to fit all 3 of those with turrets. So I've got 150 millimeter light autocannon 3s here, and they have an optimal range of 700 meters plus 5.5 kilometers. Your optimal range tells you the maximum distance at which you take no accuracy penalty for shooting a turret weapon. So if I have an optimal range of, say, 2,000 meters, that means that inside of 2,000 meters, I won't take any accuracy penalties. As you get farther and farther away from 2,000 meters, your weapon becomes less and less accurate. And eventually, at about your optimal plus your fall-off distance, that's the second number, you get about a 50% accuracy penalty. So you'll only do about half as much damage as you would, all other things being equal, had that person been within 675 meters. Horagius Mooring asks, is there a penalty if you are too close to the target? We'll cover that in a second. But for now, you'll notice that the effective range of these guns is somewhere close to 675 meters. You probably want to be orbiting, let's say, inside of, you don't want your accuracy penalty to be any higher than about 20%. So that means you need to be around 675 meters plus 20% of the way, 10% of the way between here and 5.5 kilometers. So you probably want to be about, let's say, 1,500 meters, no more than that. That's a good distance to be at. Now, if you look at Gillian Gray's Link, the 155 millimeter light autocannon, you'll notice that one of the attributes there is a tracking speed attribute. And you'll see that the tracking speed there is measured in a unit called radians per second. If you've ever looked at the angular velocity column on your overview tab, you might notice that if you don't have it active, and you would never notice that, I guess, but if you do have it active, you'll notice that it says its units in radians per second. And that tells you how quickly another ship is making a circle around you. The way to think about a radian is to imagine that you're standing at the center of a circle and your head is turning to watch something else go around the circle. If somebody went, let's say, 1/6 of the way around the circle in 1 second, then we would say that they did 60 degrees per second, right? Or if they went 1/2 of the way around the circle per second, then we would say they were doing 180 degrees per second. Well, what if they went a distance along the outside of the circle equal to the radius of the circle? The angle that makes is called 1 radian. So we measure tracking speed, or Eve measures tracking speed in radians per second. 1 radian is about 60 degrees. So if something is doing 1 radian per second, that means they're doing a full circle around you about once every 6 seconds. The guns that when guns have a tracking speed like they do here, it means that the higher you get to that number, the worse the tracking penalty for the gun will be. So if you're orbiting somebody really, really close, your guns have to change direction to hit them quickly. So that means your angular velocity with respect to them will be high, so you'll take a tracking penalty from trying to be that close. On the other hand, the other ship's guns will also take a tracking penalty from trying to track you. So generally this comes into play if you're a smaller ship shooting a larger ship, because if you're orbiting tight around that larger ship, larger guns tend to have much lower tracking speeds, which means that you'll be able to hit them much more effectively than they can hit you. Of course, larger guns also deal more damage and things like that, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. But generally speaking, larger ships are going to have a much tougher time hitting smaller ships for a number of factors like signature radii, like we talked about before, and the fact that you'll probably be moving faster because you're in a smaller ship, and because you'll be orbiting closer, that sort of thing. So all those factors conspire to reduce the overall damage you might take. So nevertheless, the effective range of this gun is probably somewhere in the 1,000 meter range. So that's optimal range and fall off. And so next up you've got the actual DPS output for those guns. So if you take a look at in PIFA, you'll have a similar display in EFT and in your Eve window, but they've divided up the DPS output into 3 different sections: your weapons, your drones, and then a volley. So your weapons tells you how effective your guns and missiles and smart bombs and torpedoes and so forth are. Your drones tell you how much damage the drone section tells you how much damage your drones will do. And then the volley measures how much damage you do in a single shot. So this is a damage over time number. So this means that you do about 111 points of damage per second. But on each volley, you do about 250 points of damage. So your rate of fire is about once every 2.5 seconds or so with this loadout. So if you look at a different ship, so here's the Caracal. This Caracal has 5 missile launchers on it. Now its DPS is kind of low for a cruiser-sized ship, but its volley is pretty high. So these missiles, in other words, take a long time in between cycles, but when they hit, they do a lot of damage all at once. Kryver Halbrin asked, does drone DPS count all drones in your drone hold or the max number of drones you can control? In both PIFA and EFT, you will check which drones you want it to count for purpose of the damage you're dealing. So you'll say, I want to launch my Hobgoblin 2s, and then it will tell you what your DPS is with the Hobgoblin 2s, or no, I want to launch my Warrior 2s instead, and it will tell you how much damage it is with whatever set of drones you have checked. So, and then likewise, if you switch to the Hurricane, you can see that it has very fast guns that fire about once every 2 seconds. So its damage over time is very high, but its volley is very low. So it relies on shooting frequently to hit things, unlike the missile boat, which shoots much less frequently, but actually has a higher volley than the more powerful Hurricane does. So again, just for comparison, the Caracal, that's a cruiser, has 225 damage per second, but a 1300 volley, whereas the Hurricane has 500 damage per second, that's twice the Caracal, but a volley that's only about 80%. Missiles don't have a fall-off range; they just have a flight time and a velocity that they travel at. So if we look at that, you'll see here that the missiles, I'm sorry, it's actually on the charge, not on the missile itself. There we go. So you see that the flight time of this missile is 9.75 seconds, and its maximum velocity is about 9,700 meters per second. So if you multiply those two numbers, you get about the maximum range of the missile. It's not going to quite be equal because this is a maximum velocity. Your missiles don't accelerate from 0 to max velocity instantaneously, so some of their flight time is used up in getting to that maximum speed. So it's a little bit less than what you would expect the optimal range to be. As a rule of thumb, you want to subtract about 10% from this amount, and that will tell you your actual range. Also, because missiles are moving while they're in flight, whether you're moving towards or away from someone has a big influence on whether or not you'll actually be able to hit them at that range. So, for example, imagine two ships that are imagine ship A is chasing after ship B, and ship A shoots its missiles. Well, if ship B is 94 kilometers away from ship A, you might say, well, okay, ship A hit him because he's inside this 94.3 missile range. But the problem is that by the time the missiles reach where ship B used to be, ship B isn't in that spot anymore. They will have had to travel a lot farther than 94 kilometers. So the effective range there is actually quite a bit shorter. You'd have to be much closer to ship B if it was running away from you to be assured of hitting it. So next up is the explosion radius and explosion velocity for missiles. The explosion radius is compared against your ship's signature radius. The bigger the explosion radius, the worse the damage will be for that missile. So missiles with big explosion radii do worse and worse damage. They can't apply their damage as well to a ship of the same signature radius. So the smaller the larger the ratio between the missile's explosion radius and the ship that it's hitting's signature radius, the worse the damage is. So, in other words, you want to shoot your missiles at really, really large signature radii ships because that helps ensure that you'll do the maximum damage. The other factor here is the explosion velocity. This works like explosion radius, but instead of being compared against signature radius, it's compared against the velocity of the ship that it's hitting. The lower this ratio, the worse the damage is. So if the ship that it's trying to hit is moving very, very fast, then the explosion won't do a lot of damage to it. If the ship is sitting totally still, the explosion does maximum damage to it, or at least that factor of it anyway. So the best kind of ships to hit with missiles are really big, really slow ships. So if you can do things like target paint people, so if you could link the Stasis Webifier module, Gillian, the target painter, and Stasis Webifier modules. Thanks. So if everyone takes a look at the target painter, you'll see that one of the things, this is an electronic warfare module, and one of the things it does is to apply a signature radius. It's described as a bonus here. That's actually a penalty to have a signature radius that's larger. So a 25% signature radius means that it's going to be easier for your missiles to hit that ship. So target painting something you want to hit with missiles is a great idea. Likewise, stasis webifiers slow another ship down, so that means they help that explosion velocity side of that equation. So if you slow a ship down that otherwise would have a really tiny signature radius, you'll be able to hit it better. Okay, so I think we covered everything on the offense side. The only other thing to cover is to note that some kinds of ammo will affect your trade-offs between damage and tracking range. So, for example, right now I've got the EMP-S ammo in here, but if I switch to something that's a little bit bulkier, like my carbonized lead, let's say, you'll see that my DPS drops a huge amount. I only have about half the DPS now, but I've got about 4 times the optimal range. So you can make different trade-offs with the same guns by switching out different kinds of ammo. That could be useful if you're fighting particular kinds of ships or if you want to pick a particular range to engage at. In frigates, there's less of a concern because the possible engagement ranges are much closer together, but that becomes more relevant in Conzim says, does Target Painter 1 also help non-missile weapons? Yes, absolutely. Signature radius is also a factor in shooting people with guns. It's less of a factor than it is with missiles, but it's still important. Okay, that covers all the offensive sides. Just a couple more things to cover, and then I think we're done. Gillian, could you link the Stasis Webifier again, please? Vulpus Velox asked, could you cover weapon hit points? I'm not sure what weapon hit points are. Are you talking about the structure on the module? Okay, yeah, we're going to talk about that in a second. So if you take a look at the Stasis Webifier 1, you'll notice that, as I just mentioned, all modules have a structural hit points. In fact, I think all of them have exactly 40 structural hit points. I don't think there's any exceptions to that. But this comes into play with a skill called thermodynamics that lets you overheat certain modules. So overheating gives you a temporary power boost to whatever that module does, usually in one or more aspects of it. But at the cost of damaging the module over time. And the more things you have overheated and the lower your thermodynamic skill, the more damage each of those modules will take. And you'll notice that each of those modules has a heat damage line in its attributes. So, for example, in our Stasis Webifier, we see that there's a heat damage of 5 hit points, and it has a structure of 40 hit points. Every time a heat cycle completes, every time an activation cycle of this module completes, it has a chance to take heat damage. And the longer you let it run, the higher that chance becomes until it eventually gets stuck at 100% chance where it's taking heat damage every single time you activate it. Each time it takes heat damage, you lose some of the structure. If the structure gets down to 0, the module burns itself out and you can't use it at all until it's repaired. It's like it went offline, basically. So if you, so what's the trade-off for that? Well, in the case of the stasis webifier, this extends the stasis web's optimal range by 30%. So instead of having to stay within 10 kilometers, you could now stay within 13 kilometers as long as you are overheating it. The way you overheat a module, assuming you have thermodynamics, is to either click the little green tab at the top of that module circle. That's kind of finicky and annoying, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. Instead, you can shift-click a module to activate its overheating ability, and that starts overheating that particular module. When you overheat a module, it'll actually start spreading its heat to everything that's in the same slot rack. So in other words, if you overheat a stasis webifier, that's a mid-slot module, that'll start burning out your other modules. Even if they're not actually being overheated, it'll start burning out the other modules that are adjacent to it and spread its heat to the left and right of those of wherever the stasis webifier is located. Conzim asks, does it lose efficiency when damaged? No. As long as a module still has some structural hit points remaining and isn't totally damaged, then it's still 100% functional. Aiden Sozani asked, that includes empty module slots, correct? I'm not sure what that question is referencing. So that you can, oh yes, right. So if you leave an empty slot in between two modules, then the heat won't be able to spread as effectively to the module on the other side of the slot. Sometimes people like to, so you'll notice that here the three guns are next to each other, which would be bad for overheating, because if you overheat them, they won't last as long as if you put something in between them. So to show that, let me overheat these three guys for you. Okay, so you'll see that, where's the overheating in here? I don't know why my overheat pop-up isn't coming up. Okay. Well, take my word for it, because if you do that, then this second gun is spreading heat to the first and third guns, whereas it's not doing that as effectively when they're separated. Okay. Well, that covers all the attributes I wanted to talk about today, and we're just about at my 90-minute time. So despite all the technical shenanigans, it appears I somehow managed to stick to the 90-minute time. So we're going to proceed now into the question and answer portion. So if I didn't get to your question beforehand, or if you have a question that's totally unrelated to this class, feel free to ask it. If you don't have a mic, go ahead and go ahead and put an X into the class.euni chat. Type out your question so that I can keep track of the order. Otherwise, just go ahead and turn on your mic and talk out loud. So, questions, anyone? Any questions at all?
Yeah, I have one.
Go for it.
Thanks for the class, first of all.
Sure.
I don't remember who asked earlier about the disruptor or the scrambler, but I remember reading something similar that the warp core needs to overpower the scrambler or the disruptor in order for you to warp out. Maybe we both read a wrong source.
Let me just restate the way it should work. There are two opposing factors. Your ship's warp core strength, which if there's nothing in the description about getting a bonus to warp core strength, then your warp core strength starts at 0.
Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off. I understood that part. My question is, for example, if I'm using a disruptor right now, I can't disrupt any ship by myself. Is that correct? Because all ships have +1.
No, that is not correct. All ships start at 0 warp core strength. Your warp disruptor.
Oh, I see. Not all ships have +1.
No, all ships start at 0 unless otherwise specified in their description.
I got you. Okay,
So you need at least as many points of warp scramble strength on someone as their warp core strength. So since
yeah, you need more than them to stop them to warp out.
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, by the way, if you don't have a question, or if you're planning on leaving shortly, please fill out go to the forum thread I've linked there for the class and tell me what you thought of the class, things that you wished I'd covered, things that you think I shouldn't have covered, things you'd like to hear more about, things you'd like to hear less about, whether I did a good job, etc., etc. All of those things would be great to hear from you, because that's how these kinds of classes improve, and that's how we learn, is from hearing what the students want to hear. So again, I'll post that forum thread link one more time. So please go ahead and paste your thoughts there. Okay, next question. I'm sorry, what's the problem? Oh, sure. Sure. I posted it in, oops, actually I sent it to the entire Eve University classrooms, but hopefully you guys saw that. Okay, other questions, comments, thoughts, etc.? You could have questions about anything. It doesn't have to be about fitting or ship attributes. It could be about anything you want.
Hi, Seluna, Kevin up here. I'm looking at this PIFA. I haven't even heard of that before.
Hadn't heard of what before?
PIFA, Python Fitting Assistant.
Oh, PIFA, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, let me link that, since several people seem to be asking about that.
I mean, I've got EFT and EVMON, but I haven't used this before.
So I've linked the PIFA website, which is evefit.org. There's a few things PIFA is a little wonky on. Also, EFT is much faster than PIFA in terms of like looking up items and things like that. All right, other questions? The questions. Again, it could be about anything.
I have a quick...
I'm sorry, it sounds like I interrupted someone. Go ahead.
It's okay. I have a quick question about the other types of EWAR. What, we talked about the warp scrambling and the different stats that affect it. What about the other types? I guess there's tracking disruptors. What stats counteract that?
Sure. Technically speaking, warp scramblers and warp disruptors are not counted as EWAR modules. When we say EWAR, we're usually talking about one of the following kinds of modules. Warp scramblers and warp disruptors and stasis webifiers are in a different class of module called propulsion jamming. It's not quite EWAR, but the EWAR modules are target painters, sensor dampeners, tracking disruption, and ECM, which is electronic countermeasures. Those are jammers. So again, sensor dampeners, target painters, tracking disruption, and ECM. Each of the four races is sort of more strongly associated with one of the four types. So, for example, Minmatar ships that are EWAR focused usually get bonuses to target painters, whereas say the Caldari ships that are EWAR focused tend to get bonuses to ECM, etc. So those are the four kinds of modules. The sensor dampeners decrease your effective range, decrease your targeting range and decrease your optimal range. So sensor dampening decreases your scan resolution and your targeting range. And tracking disruption decreases your tracking speed and your optimal range. ECM jams you, so it will break your target locks if it successfully lands. And what was the one I forgot? Sensor dampeners, tracking disruption. Oh, target painters, we talked about those. Those increase your signature radius.
So how would you defend against having your target broken? What modules or what stats counteracts that?
So ECM is measured against your ship's sensor strength. That's one of the ones we didn't really cover, just because it's only useful in limited circumstances. But sensor strength, if you look at
and I think you cut out.
Eve just crashed on me too.
Eve crashed?
Yeah, Eve's crashed on me. And I can get the launcher, but there's no play button.
I still seem to be connected.
I think the server.
Yeah, I'm connected.
Servers are getting attacked again. Dust server just went down.
Okay. Again, if you I'll paste it in Mumble one more time just in case you can't see Eve. Oops, that's not the link. 1 second. There we go. So yeah, please fill that out. So you were asking about how does sensor strength figure into ECM. So every ECM module has a jamming strength that goes up against the target ship's sensor strength. And there are 4 different flavors of sensors. So there's radar, magnetometric, gravimetric, and radar. And those four flavors are associated with each of the races. So, for example, radar is Minmatar's sensor type, and so on. So if you pick a jamming flavor, you're basically trying to jam that particular kind of ship. And all of the jamming modules either favor, so for example, there are radar jammers that jam radar ships much more effectively than they jam other kinds of ships. And that just means that their jamming strength against radar sensors is higher than, say, radar or gravimetric or magnetometric, etc. So that means that so if your ECM modules have, let's say, a radar jamming strength of 5, and you go up against a ship with a radar sensor strength of 10, that means you have a 50% chance per cycle to jam that ship for the duration of your cycle. And the jamming cycles, I believe, are 20 seconds. So if you successfully land a jam, that ship loses all of its target locks and can't relock anything for another 20 seconds. Or possibly longer if you keep getting to rejam it over and over again. Usually if you have multiple ECM modules, like if you're on a Blackbird or another ship that specializes in ECM, you'll probably try to cycle your jam so that you always have a couple on them at a time if you're trying to jam someone out. And that way when one jam ends, the other is beginning, and or the other is still going on, so it will never be unjammed for more than a few seconds at a time. Does that explain, whoever asked that, how sensor strength and ECM interact adequately?
Yes, actually, thank you.
Sure. Becky Ario asked, my Galente cruiser comes with 15 points of magnetometric sensor strength. What's that about? I don't know if I understand the question. Maybe you could be more specific, Becky. I'll follow up with you after I get to this next one. Conzim asked, if I have 5 slots for 4 guns, the best to do would be 2 gun, 1 something, 2 gun. I assume you're talking about in terms of minimizing the heat damage, in which case, yes, that would be the best thing to do. Put your empty or non-gun slots in the middle so that they isolate the things that are heating each other. You could also just leave that slot blank if you couldn't fit anything else. For example, if you didn't have room for a neutralizer, that might be best just to leave that empty if you're planning on overheating, so that you get some more DPS cycles out of your gun. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Becky Ario asked, what do those magnetometric points affect or resist? Your sensor strength affects how hard your ship is to jam. The higher your sensor strength, the more difficult you are to jam. Because again, like I said, when ECM modules are applied to your ship's sensor strength is matched against the ECM's jamming strength. The higher the jamming strength, the higher the chance that you will be jammed. If the jamming strength is higher than your ship's sensor strength, then you will always be jammed 100% of the time. I don't think there are any ships for which that's actually true, where you could get 100% chance of jamming something, but yeah. Constance Macob asked, E5 prototype energy vampire, for the energy transfer amount, how much is 9.2 points? That just means 9.2 gigajoules, so 9.2 of your enemy's capacitor will be drained from their ship and added to your ship. If you had an energy neutralizer, that would just drain it from their ship without adding it to your ship. Oh yes, CAPRAB brings up a good point, which is that one way to increase your sensor strength if you want to avoid being jammed, which is important for, it's important for all ships, I guess, but it's especially important for ships that can't afford to lose target locks for very long, like logistic ships is an important one. If you can't repair your friends, then their tank drops very dramatically. So ECCM, not to be confused with ECM, which is short for electronic countermeasures, those are modules which increase your sensor strength for a particular type of sensor. Other questions? Again, just a reminder to fill out that forum thread if you haven't already. Tell me what you like, didn't like, things you'd like to hear more of, less of, etc. Other questions going once? Other questions going twice? All right, I think sounds like I've answered all the questions. So thanks very much for coming to the class, and this has been Ship Mechanics. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other thoughts or concerns or questions, I'd love to hear them. You can either drop a line in the forum, or if you don't want to do that and you just feel like talking to me directly, please feel free to email me. Thanks very much to Ada Kiga for recording, and to Gillian for doing my linking, and to Flip for doing my screencast linking. So thanks very much to you guys, and thanks very much to everyone for coming. I hope it was instructional and informative. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks a lot.